Mark, into the last three rounds of the championship now, Las Vegas. Thoughts on Vegas? What's it like there in the new version of Vegas? And
Yeah.
thoughts on the race, the circuit, the whole place?
So it's on the Strip, so the newer part of the city, I guess it is, just amongst all the high-rise buildings, and obviously there's the Sphere that's on all the time. It was pretty weird because we were very late at night that we were working. And it's also typically a quiet weekend for Vegas anyway, apparently last weekend before, is it Thanksgiving, I think, which I think is why they put the race on that weekend to try and drum up some interest. But so you tend to be leaving for the track sort of late afternoon. And obviously you go down the lobby of the hotel, everyone's in there playing at the machines. It's a bit strange, and then you walk into the track, and then from that point it's pretty basic. It's you're going through sort of yards and just pretty rough areas before you get to the paddock itself. The paddock's quite big, open expanse. Team hospitality on the left on a sort of raised area. First year they made the walkway too narrow in front of the building, so everyone was getting each other's way, but they made it wider last year. The pits are decent size. The track, they resurfaced the whole thing for the race when they started. Obviously there's the turn 1, 2, 3, 4 all on the land that F1 actually bought to build the pit complex, whereas the rest of it's actually the streets. It's very fast, so it's just a mixture of straights and pretty slow speed corners, apart from turn 3, 4, which is really one corner, and turn 6, which is a very high speed left-hander. But other than that, it's fairly slow corners but long straights, so you have to run a fairly low downforce level. And the grip level's not particularly high. And the biggest issue, or one of the big issues, is the temperature, because it's at night in November in Vegas. I think it's forecast to be around about 10 degrees centigrade this year for most of the sessions. I think the first year we were there, it was struggling to get above 7 or 8 degrees. And that means with the low energy from the circuit and the low downforce level and the low ambient temperatures, it's actually quite difficult to get the tyres working, even though they'll bring, I think it's the C3, 4 and 5, so the softer end of the range. So that's pretty tricky. The circuit, it's not a particularly interesting circuit it's no Interlagos, that's for sure, or Spa. But it's typical of sort of modern era street circuit, I suppose. And obviously not a lot of room for error. You'll hit a wall if you go too far offline, so that's okay. It's got a couple of curbs that the drivers have to negotiate, which adds a bit of interest to the sort of setup side of things. And it's hard on the tyres, actually. The right front gets a really hard time. We saw a lot of graining there the last couple of years, less so last year than the first year. And it's quite hard on the rears as well because of the traction requirement. So yeah, it's quite a tricky track. I think it was 2 stops last year, wasn't it? Most people ran mediums and hards. And I think that's the wear of that right front and the rears is the problem. So it's not so much that the tyres are overheating and going off. It's more that they do wear out, and so you can't. It's a real struggle to do a one-stop race there.
You're talking about the time at which you get to the track. What sort of time zone do you keep in terms of your body clock then for Vegas?
When we worked it out in the first year that we were actually on Japanese time, effectively. So it's kind of neither one thing nor the other. I think this year last year they moved it a little bit earlier, and I think it's the same this year. But because I don't remember if you remember the first year, there was the issues with Science's car getting badly damaged in the first practice session, so P2 was delayed massively, and it was very, very late, and it was you're getting back to the hotel when there's no one around apart from the cleaners, and I have to say that it's not the best. It's not a particularly fun event, I found, to be honest. The first couple of nights when you can get back to the hotel a little bit earlier, there's maybe a few bars still open in the hotels, but if you like hotel bars and big hotels with stuff in them, then that's great, but it's not really my cup of tea, I'm afraid. Yeah.
No, I think you speak for a lot there, Mark. Getting back to the setup,
Yeah.
tell us about the compromise between obviously wanting to have a lot of top speed, obviously wanting to have as much grip as possible, and
Yeah.
indeed the time management factor that comes into play, ride heights and everything else. And what's the, do you think anyone will end up with a car that is substantially quicker in terms of terminal velocity than anybody else this weekend?
All the teams tend to gravitate towards the same setup in the end, because there's the downside of running too much drag is quite high, just because the number of straights and I mean there's turn 17, turn 10, turn 11. They're corners, but they're also very high speed. They're flat, unless your tire management says that you shouldn't be, say, turn 11. But so it tends to be that I think all the cars will end up running very similar and very fast top speeds. So and that means that generating grip is a problem. There's not an awful lot you can do about that from a setup point of view, other than trying to play tricks with your brake ducts as much as possible. But realistically, you have to set those for the race because you're doing continuous running. So for qualifying, it's really down to the drivers learning how to generate the temperatures they need on their outlaps. I think, being a fairly difficult to get the tires up to temperature, we might see multiple laps in qualifying, so a fair amount of fast, slow, fast running, and the slow laps might not be that slow. But on the other hand, though, although the tire temperature is difficult to get into the right window, you can't get the surface temperatures too hot. There is a difference between the surface temperature requirement and the bulk tire temperature requirement. So again, it's up to the drivers really to try to manage that the best they can. And on the outlaps, that'll mean running quite high speeds through the higher speed corners, bit of brake throttle overlap to try and generate some decent brake temperatures, a bit of gentle weaving. You don't want the tires to be sliding dramatically across the surface, but if you can put a bit of load into the tires by a bit of weaving, that will help as well. And they'll run DRS probably on the outlap, because that transfers more load to the front tires, so you try and get a bit more temperature in the fronts than the rears, because the rears are easier to get temperature than the fronts, just because they're connected to your right foot, basically. All
good tools for the Oscar Piastri low surface grip toolbox.
Yes, but then we saw that he was good in Montreal. So
yeah, I know. I was being facetious, obviously.
Yeah, sure. I don't think that'll be a problem. I think the only other thing that has previously been interesting about that track is at turn 15, which is the sort of three corners at the end of the long straight. There's an inside curve at turn 15, and if you can run over that, you can gain quite a bit of lap time on the exit. Now, the reason I point that out is because obviously the McLaren used to have a bit of an advantage in being nice and soft and able to run curbs, but we've seen that they seem to have given that up a bit for this year in all the quest for downforce. So it'll be interesting just to keep an eye on who's able to take that curve more aggressively and gain a tenth on the exit, getting on the power a bit quicker.
Yeah. Just to clarify one point, I guess the restrictions that Pirelli within which they operate now in terms of toe in, toe out, camber is not enough to play around with tire temperatures anymore? Not
really. They're very prescriptive on the cambers in particular. So the teams will be just limited to what probably they'll just run at the maximum that they're allowed to run, because that maximum might be relatively low. I mean, typically the cars are running less camber, particularly at the front, than they would if they had a free hand. The only other difference between the cars then is the amount of camber change that the cars have. So that's the amount that the tyre cambers as the car ride height reduces. But that's something that I think teams have gravitated towards lower values over time, because if you're limited in the maximum, then if you've got lots of camber change, you end up having to run the tyres very upright in order to avoid going too negative. So that's not a good thing. So that tends to mean that the camber change at the tyres the teams run is quite low these days. Yeah. And in terms of toe, to be honest, in my time, when we've tried playing with toe to generate tyre temperature, it hasn't really had a very big effect. And it is a surface tyre temperature effect more than anything else. And that's kind of the opposite of what you want in a way. Yeah. So, that can be quite negative, to be honest.
Yeah, back in the days of the tyre war, when we had more than one company in Formula One, toe was more to do just with turn-in on specific corners. Corners that you really want a good toe in, it worked quite well. But
yeah, it would depend. I mean, you could. So we on the McLaren in '98, we used to run a lot of toe in at the rear to improve entry stability.
Okay, on the rear,
whereas on the front, you're right. Running lots of toe out makes the car stable on the initial turn in, but on a bumpy circuit, it can make the car quite darty. So in Monaco, that can cause problems. Yeah. And yeah, I think, but the values that people run are pretty standard these days. I think most people run a mil out, 2 mil out at the front across the car to give a little bit of stability. And the rear, we've ended up running quite low levels of toe at the rear because we tended to find that adding toe in to help stability actually seemed to make the car snappier on power without giving much in the way of entry stability. It seemed to be a function of the Pirelli tyres in particular. Certainly the cars I've run for the last sort of 10 years or so, we were running close to zero toe at the rear.
Really?
Yeah.
So Mark, your take on this weekend? I mean, it sounds like Ferrari won't be too bad there if they're quick on the straight. I mean, on that many corners to trouble them. I don't know what they'll be like on that curb. Obviously, McLaren will be good. Do you think Red Bull and Merc will be right there?
I think Mercedes could be very strong. I think it could suit them very well. Red Bull, I mean, obviously Max did very well in Singapore, so it's got some similarities with that, but not as many corners. The straight line speed advantage, I mean, Ferrari are strong in that area. We could see Haas doing quite well in qualifying with good strong speed. McLaren struggled there last year, and it seemed to be a function of their good tyre degradation comes largely from keeping wheel temperatures down. And obviously, when you're struggling for tyre temperature, that can bite you. And that's actually one of the reasons why the Haas was quick in qualifying a couple of years ago in 23. We had a car that was much too aggressive on its tyres. But actually, when the conditions were cold, we were actually quite quick. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think you could see McLaren maybe struggling a little bit on their outlaps. And obviously what happens then is the priority is getting a clear lap so the driver can push to get the temperatures up. If he encounters some traffic or something on his outlap or gets a queue at the end of the lap and has to wait to start his lap, that becomes a real problem. And not just for the tyre temperatures, but it starts to become a psychological problem for the driver as well, because he knows the lap that he needs to do for his outlap to get his tyres right up to temperature. And if he doesn't get that, he's kind of starting his quali lap with a little bit of a negative in his mind. So that can be a problem.
Thank you very much. See you soon.